Well, this morning we continue the story of Jacob, and we're doing a series on turning points, and I think it's an interesting story this morning. And so Jacob is on the run after deceiving his brother not once but twice. And you recall last week that he had this moment that he was between a rock and a hard place, and then God gave him a vision of a stairway to heaven and promised that he would be with him. And so we are in Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 through 18, and I invite you to read along. Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from the well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brother, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they answered, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and the son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban had heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you not work for something? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, so for those kind of a Hebrew context, it means she wasn't a looker, okay? But Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. She was a looker, apparently. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." May the Lord bless his word to our hearts and minds this morning. Well, this morning, we're thinking about blessings of patience, blessings of patience. I don't know about you, but during this whole pandemic thing, and I have my face mask on when I'm not up here, and folks out there have face masks on, or everywhere we go, we have face masks on. I don't know if you've had a case of mistaken identity. The other day, my daughter and I, Savannah, were walking into the grocery store, and this gentleman is walking my way, and he's got a baseball cap on and glasses, and we get up close, and he says, "Hi, TJ, how you doing?" And I looked at him, and I said, "Hi," and I couldn't figure out who it was, so I said, "I'm doing great, how are you doing?" Have you had a moment like that? And then my daughter looks at me and goes, I said, "Do you know who that was?" She said, "I have no idea." I mean, with the baseball cap and the glasses and the mask, no idea. So we went in the grocery store, and I thought I saw a woman that I knew, and so I walked right up to her, and my daughter knew what was going to happen. She goes, "Dad, it's not her." And I walked up and said, "Hey, hope you're having a good day." So I don't know what she thought, but have you had a moment of mistaken identity with these? I mean, some folks are very distinctive no matter what, but there's folks that are kind of look like other people, and I've gone up to them, and I don't know, maybe we've made some new friends that way, but I always say something good, and everybody seems to understand it. Well, in this morning's reading, there's an interesting case of mistaken identity. And so I do think, despite the fact that it's an interesting twist of things, that there's some spiritual truths there that can be ours this morning. And so we pick up this story of Jacob, who's on the run, who's deceived his brother Esau not once but twice. Big stakes deception, by the way. And Jacob's name meant deceiver, right? And so Jacob deceived Esau out of his birthright first and then out of his blessing. And Esau is so angry that Jacob has to go on the run. You ever been running from your problems, your issues in life? And so it was with Jacob. He tried to manipulate and get God's blessings, and all it did was backfire on him in a certain way. But God's promise remained with Jacob. And so when he's on his way, his father sent him to a far-off land, to the home of his uncle, his distant uncle. And so on the way, he's traveled a whole day, and he's exhausted and probably discouraged, I think. And so he lay down with just the clothes on his back and put his head on a pillow for a rock. And he literally was between a rock and a hard place. And so we looked at that last week. I don't know if you've been in a place where you are literally between a rock and a hard place. And in that moment of discouragement, God met him in the middle of the night and gave him a vision of this stairway to the heavens with angels ascending and descending. And the top of this great ladder, reaching to heaven, he heard the voice of the Lord promise him the promise that went to Abraham and Sarah and to Isaac his father, a promise that he would be a great people and that all nations would be blessed because of him and that God would always be with him. And so when Jacob arose the next morning, he said, God, if you will always journey with me and bring me back to my family, then I will always bless you with my life. I'll give you a tenth of everything that I have and pray your promise will be with you. And so he put that pillar upright and anointed it with oil, a way of blessing it with the symbol of the Holy Spirit, and prayed that other travelers would be blessed as well. It became a symbol, and he named the place the house of God, Bethel, literally. He said, how awesome is this place? Isn't it just like God to sometimes meet us in a place where we are between a rock and a hard place? And it might be in a hospital room. It might be in an unemployment line. It might be in a moment where relationships seem to be falling apart. But God meets us sometimes when all we got is God to look to. And so we continue that story, and Jacob gets up and he travels to the distant land. And there he's discouraged and tired probably still, but he's got this promise. And so he sees some shepherds. And they're gathered around this place where the well is, and that time, a lot of times, they would guard a well, and they protect it from drying out by putting a large rock on top of it. And so he asked them how they're doing. They said, great. He said, have you heard of Laban, my uncle? And they said, sure. And as a matter of fact, here comes Rachel, his daughter. She's a shepherd. And so Jacob sees her, and he ends up using all his muscles to move this rock and waters the sheep for her. And in this moment, he just seems to fall in love with Rachel. And so this hard-headed, lug-headed Jacob falls in love. And so he goes to his uncle's home, and he works for him for a month, and then Laban comes to Jacob and says, listen, you can't work for free, even though you're a relative, so what would you like? And Jacob knows exactly what he wants. He wants this beloved Rachel. And he says, listen, I want to work for Rachel. And in that culture, that's what you did. There was a dowry, and you had to pay for that in exchange. And so Laban says, if you work for me for 7 years, and you have Rachel, my youngest daughter. And so the writer says, if you read it on, he says, Jacob was so in love, 7 years went by like a day. It's beautiful, isn't it? And so it comes time for the wedding. And we don't know what kind of a bachelor party this was and what kind of wedding banquet. But anyway, Jacob gets married and they go home to the tent, and he wakes up the next morning, and it's not Rachel, it's Leah. You can imagine what that breakfast conversation was like. And so, and I know this is more like a soap opera than Sunday morning, right? It's PG-13 for those of you out there, but it's interesting. And so Jacob doesn't know what to do. He goes to Laban and he says, listen, I worked for Rachel and I woke up and it's Leah. And boy, that must have been some kind of wedding banquet. But anyway, and Laban says, well, listen, where we are, the oldest daughter has to get married first. And Jacob says, it would have been nice to know that firsthand, right? So, and Laban says, I tell you what, you work another 7 years for Rachel and you can have Rachel right now. And Jacob says, okay. So, and I know that's different in our culture today, but I think there's some interesting truths that are here this morning when you look at it, which is sometimes have you known in life that sometimes you want Rachel, but you get a Leah. You have a Leah moment. You think everything is painted with this beautiful sunrise and everything's going to be just perfect, and all of a sudden life throws you an unexpected twist and you don't know quite what to do. And so that happened to Jacob. And here's the interesting thing. Not culture, of course, you could marry twice there. But Jacob, even though he does marry Rachel, remains faithful to Leah as well. And in his patience and faithfulness, God begins to do a work. Now, it's interesting because you recall that Jacob was the deceiver, right? So the deceiver has been deceived by the master deceiver, Laban, you know? Sometimes our tricks, our qualities that we hate worst, boomerang on us, and God has some lessons for us. And so Jacob learned a hard lesson. But it's interesting, as he was learning the virtue of patience and faithfulness, God did an amazing thing. And through the course of the years, Leah went on to have 10 children with Jacob. And you know, one of those children was a young man by the name of Judah. And from Judah came the tribe of Judah. And from the tribe of Judah, do you know, came King David. And from King David came who? Jesus. Jesus. And so I think sometimes in our faithfulness, we don't understand why life will throw us a twist and life will throw us a turn. But God, if we're patient, God, if we're faithful, God sometimes has some veiled blessings that are there for us if we just pursue that. What in you has thrown a Leah moment? Hospital rooms and, you know, unemployment lines, people we know who are sick from this COVID thing, we've lost loved ones. Sometimes in the midst of all of that, God can give us an unexpected blessing. Paul knew about patience, right? In fact, in our vacation Bible school, we learned about the fruit of the Spirit. One of those was patience, do you recall? And my daughter and I always say, patience is something we don't have, right? So, and if you pray for patience, God is going to give you something in your life. Believe me, God always answers that prayer. But it's interesting because as Paul wrote many of his letters, Paul was in prison. Now, Paul was a type A personality. Paul was a go-getter. But Paul spent a number of chapters for years in prison. And while Paul was in prison, Paul wrote half the New Testament, half the letters of the New Testament were written by Paul when he was in prison. I don't think that if Paul was not in prison, that Paul never would have slowed down long enough to write all those letters that bless us today. It's amazing, isn't it? There's a great story that I love of this rabbi in ancient days who was on his way to town, lived out in the outskirts, and every day he'd walk into town. One day, God visited him in a vision, and the Lord said to this rabbi, listen, you know that big boulder on the road on the way to town? And the rabbi said, yeah, sure, I know that boulder. And God said, every day on your way to town, I want you to push on that boulder. And so the rabbi said, okay, Lord. So every day the rabbi goes and he pushes on this boulder, and weeks go by, and this boulder is so big it's never budged an inch. So finally, the tempter comes to the rabbi and whispers to him, you know, you're making a fool out of yourself pushing on that boulder. Everybody's laughing at you, and that boulder's never going to budge. And so the rabbi was discouraged by that. And so the next day, the rabbi didn't push on that boulder. And in the coming days, the rabbi didn't push on that boulder. But then the Lord appeared to the rabbi again. And the Lord said, why don't you stop pushing on that stone? And the rabbi said, you know, for weeks and weeks and weeks, I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and I never moved that stone. And the Lord said, whoever said anything about moving the stone? And then the Lord began to whisper to the rabbi all the blessings that had come from his patience in pushing on that stone. He had a new kind of faithfulness and strength, and with his new strength, he was able to help the elderly carry buckets of water from the stream to the village every day, and he was able to help the widows chop wood. And because he was pushing on that stone every day, other people would gather around, and so he had some new friendships as he pushed on the boulder. And of course, his patience and faithfulness was strengthened, and so the rabbi pushed the boulder again. What's the boulder that God has placed in your life right now? What's the boulder that's there that just seems too big to budge, but God is doing a work not in the boulder, but in you? In our lives, as we move towards patience and we have veiled blessings that happen to us in those moments. I don't know what's happened to you. For Jacob, the blessings were down the road. He had to be patient, but God was doing an amazing work because Jesus was on the way to that faithfulness. And I think many times in our life, as we're faithful to those moments, as we're pushing on the boulder, that Jesus is going to show up and Jesus is going to bless us in a veiled way that we never knew before. There's a great Amy Grant song that was out some time ago, and the lyrics go something like this, you know, what if God's blessings are raindrops in disguise? What if God's blessings are raindrops in disguise? What about those trials and moments of life where you are heartbroken along the way and God touches you in an unexpected way with an unexpected blessing? Amy Grant's own account tells about how she went through a failed relationship, was so discouraged, but in that moment, God also brought her a new love for her life. And so she speaks into that moment. I heard a number of interviews about that. You never know that God isn't at work in the raindrops, and there will be a rainbow as the sun begins to break through. You never know that along the trail of life, as we're pushing on that boulder, that God isn't at work in the boulder that we're pushing on. What is God working at in your life? I want to close with this one thought, which is that of the great hymn writer Fanny Crosby. She's one of the greatest and most beloved hymn writers of all time. Wrote over 8,000 hymns. I don't know anyone who's written more. And a number of them are in our hymnal. One of them is Blessed Assurance, just a fantastic hymn. It's been updated with some folks too, for those who like contemporary music. But the story goes of Fanny Crosby that when she was young, that she became ill and she had some kind of infection in her eye. And so her mom took her to the doctor. She was just like 5 or 6 years old. And the doctor gave her medicine. It turned out to be the wrong prescription. Instead of healing her eyes, she became blind and was blind the rest of her life. She learned to play the piano. When she was blind, she wrote all the hymns that she ever wrote while she was blind. Late in her life, I believe it was in her early 90s, there was someone who was interviewing her. And as she was sharing about her life and the hymns that she had written, the person said, you know, that doctor that gave you the wrong medicine that caused you to become blind, are you angry at that doctor? And Fanny Crosby said, you know, I'm not angry. Because if it wasn't for that doctor, I wouldn't have become blind. And if it wasn't for my blindness, I don't think I could hear the music that God reveals to me in my heart. I wouldn't know the piano like I do. I wouldn't see the visions that I do. I wouldn't be tuned into God's Spirit. And I never would have written all those hymns. It was a blessing in disguise. What blessing amid the time where we are all sort of semi-disguised with veils on? Even amid this pandemic, is there a blessing that God has for you? Maybe you can slow down a little bit, spend more time with loved ones. God might be giving you a restart in life that is renewed and a new blessing. God might give you a new vision for a new future. God might be rebuilding a relationship. God might be rebuilding his relationship with you as we open our hearts and lives. Know this, that whatever obstacle, whatever sort of sudden turn happens in our life, you may find, like Jacob, that in that unexpected turn of life, in that disappointment, God has hidden a veiled blessing for you. If we're only patient, if we're only faithful, we will find a new blessing and new fruitfulness. Will you join me in prayer? Lord, as we are in your presence this morning, in your house, Lord, all of us seem to be pushing against some boulder this morning as we're all facing this pandemic, some more than others. But Lord, for all of us, we know that you're present with us there, that you are whispering to us. Help us to listen to your voice. Help us to realize that in this difficulty in life, in this boulder that is in our way, in this veiled moment, there is a hidden blessing if we only trust you and if we're only patient. In Christ's name, and all God's people said, amen.